Hey, hi, welcome everyone. I'm just going to give it a minute while everyone kind of jumps on. Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and get started. So good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, where we will be discussing the economic housing market outlook for 2021. My name is Jennifer Von Pullman, and I'm the Director of Content and PR here at ATTOM Data Solutions. It's kind of a brief overview of items that will be discussed in today's webinar. Also, I'll give you a quick introduction about who is ATTOM Data Solutions, as well as the various data products and solutions that ATTOM offers. There we will dive into what you all came for, which is a detailed analysis on the 2021 economic housing market outlook for 2021. Leading this discussion are two of the industry's most knowledgeable thought leaders, Todd Teta, Chief Product and Technology Officer at ATTOM, and Ali Wolf, Chief Economist for Zonda. Now, please feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation through the question box, and we'll be sure to respond in today's webinar or within 2 business days. Okay, so ATTOM Data Solutions is your one-stop shop for premium property data with flexible delivery solutions. Our mission is to power real estate transparency and to fuel innovation across various industries with the most comprehensive property data. Now, here you can see a better picture of all the various data products that ATTOM offers. This is the ATTOM table of data elements, and it shows how we organize our data into 4 main categories. You have property and owner, which track a lot of information about individual properties, including property characteristics, mortgages, transactions, listing information, and ownership. We offer the most complete nationwide coverage of the foreclosure data and building permits, which provides all available historical permitted work that has been performed on a property. We also have the neighborhood. Now, while our property data can tell you a lot about a home and its history, our neighborhood data sets are going to provide detailed information about the area where a property is located. Also, you can see the boundaries, and then boundaries are the spatially oriented data that defines an area on a piece of land. Many of our customers utilize our boundary shape files and present the boundaries on a map, or to use within a database to determine if a point, like a property, is within a specific boundary. And then finally, we have analytics and derived. This is basically data sets that we create from our other data. These include our AVM values, equity values, and estimated sales values. 3 data sets that we will, we've gone into more detail. Now, our data is not one size fits all. Our flexible delivery options, such as bulk data licensing, API, match and append, data as a service, and other solutions, give you a choice when it comes to how you consume the data and also how much data you want to consume. We tailor our solutions to meet the challenges and opportunities in your industry and for your specific objectives. So now with that, I'd like to introduce Ali Wolf, Chief Economist for Zonda. Take it away, Ali.
Thanks, Jen, and hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event. As mentioned, I am Ali Wolf, the Chief Economist with Zonda, here to go through some of the economic and housing market metrics to watch through the rest of this year and into 2021. Now, if you're not familiar with Zonda, many of you may know the names Myers Research, Metro Study, or Hanley Wood. We are all one company, and we rebranded a couple months ago under Zonda. Our company tracks the entire land cycle from raw land all the way up to the closing of new home communities. We are mostly focused on the new home space, but of course, to understand what's happening in the new home market, you have to understand what's going on in the resale world, you have to look at policy, and of course, you have to look at economics. And that's where I want to start today, by looking at the intersection of the COVID crisis and what that did to the wider economy and to the job market. And the first thing we have to acknowledge is that the vaccine is here. We actually have seen it get administered across the country. We had that very quick FDA approval, and there's a lot of enthusiasm about the growth that's going to come in 2021. So can we go back to normal yet? And the answer is not just yet. There was a great quote by the CEO, Jamie Dimon, with JP Morgan Chase that said, "Now is the time to double down. ensure that things don't get worse, ensure that our hospitalizations don't get overburdened, because if we don't let the economy collapse between now and then, our recovery looks completely different. But what we do have to recognize is our hospitalizations are at an all-time high. And as the virus starts to spread more, we're seeing some shutdowns in economies, either state or local across the US. And you also just have people that are genuinely nervous about the virus, and they've decided to self-select out of the economy, and that impacts overall transactions as well. What's interesting, though, about the shutdowns is it doesn't impact every sector and every individual in the same way. And that's because we are living through what's called a K-shaped recovery. I'm sure many of you know about the K-shape, but in case you don't, what it tells you is that there are people and there are businesses that have a higher net worth and are more profitable today than in February of this year. In their case, this economy is working for them. At the same time, you have the bottom half of the K, conferences, concerts, people that can't work from home, families that are struggling with childcare, where today's environment doesn't feel like a recession. In some cases, it feels like a depression. And so when you look at the K and you break it out by sector, you can see this really becomes alphabet soup, because there's a whole bunch of different takes on the state of the economy depending on the sector you're in. So concerts, conferences, they're an L shape, where the economy basically collapsed and things haven't come back yet. They're poised for some strength in mid-2021 when the vaccine is widely available. You see manufacturing and restaurants and agriculture following that swoosh shape. We dropped, we saw initial gain, and now it's starting to grow, but at a slower pace. And for housing, we have upgraded. It's no longer a V-shaped recovery, which is basically as quick as it went down is as quick as it returned. Housing is that super V-shaped recovery where home sales on the new home side are up 40% compared to the same time last year. And if you're in the home building industry, or if you're any at all related to really residential housing, the economy feels okay. And you almost wonder, why do you need stimulus? And why is there all this talk about the economy that's struggling? Because from our frame of reference, things look awesome. And that's because we have low mortgage rates, because we have demographics that are really strong on the millennial side, but also the Gen Xers who for a while weren't moving, and now they have a whole bunch of equity and a reason to move because COVID-19 changed their lifestyle, plus boomers who have gained market share this year. They're trying to take advantage of, the high stock prices that they have and their home equity. We have a thriving stock market. We have, like I said, the healthy home equity, and importantly, the differentiator of 2020 is the work from home economy that has put people more time at home. And it's the number one reason why people say they are buying homes right now anyways. What we don't have is a strong labor market. And in normal times, you would look at the labor market to understand what's going on with consumer demand. Today, you don't really look at it as closely because of that K-shaped recovery. Because if you look at this chart, it would suggest that the housing market should be in a really dark place. Let me explain it to you. So the y-axis going up and down is showing you how much did jobs lose going into a recession. The x-axis is telling you how long did it take for those jobs to come back. You see the green line, really a big drop in term and compares to other recessions that were close to the Great Recession, and then a really protracted recovery. What you see here is obviously one of those recessions looks a lot different than the others, which is the COVID recession. We had that dramatic drop. We lost over 20 million jobs almost overnight. We're now 56% recovered. And in November, we saw data that confirmed what we believed, that the economy does continue to grow, but it's growing at a decelerating pace. And when you look at the data, you have to go beyond the headlines. The headlines would tell you, hey, we went from a 15% unemployment rate to a 6.7% unemployment rate this year. Things are are getting really close to becoming healthy again. The problem is when you look at the headlines, you miss the data below the surface. And one of the important things to look at is the labor force. We had 4.1 million people who left the labor force this year. They were happily working in February, and because of some kind of circumstance, maybe early retirement, forced retirement, maybe they're scared of the virus, maybe they have childcare issues, they've had to step aside. If those 4 million people got added back in to the labor force, because once you're out, you're not unemployed, even though we know that these people were happily employed, or you assume they're happily employed. So you add that back in, our unemployment rate then gets closer to 9%. So you still see the pain on that front. And interestingly, many of you have probably heard the phrase economic scarring, which the longer things go on, the longer people are unemployed, the more their job maybe gets replaced or it gets automated, or they don't have a business to go back to because their company has gone under. We're seeing some signs of economic scarring, in particular with that bottom half of the K. As such, when you try to forecast forward, we have to acknowledge that the labor market is going to be a lot slower to come back than the broader economy. So let's just do some basic math. We talked about how 245,000 jobs were added in November. Let's say that that rate just continued going forward. If we had 245,000 every month going forward from here on out, it would take us 3.3 years to be fully recovered. Now, if you're like me, you're looking at that number and you're saying, yeah, but we have the COVID economy in the near future. We're probably going to see a few months of really rapid growth as businesses try to ramp up to meet the demand. Let's say October's pace, where we added 610,000 jobs, is the right average as you stretch it out. That would suggest it'll take us 1.5 years to be fully recovered. So when you look at that, it's not that we're going to have a quick snapback in the overall picture. And this really matches with what the Federal Reserve said this week with their employment forecasts. They revised their numbers, and what the Fed is calling for is that the unemployment rate finishes this year at 6.7. Then we see a continued improvement, but we still are at 5% in 2021. And it takes until 2023 that we have an economy that looks similar to what we did in February of this year. So it shows how some of that economic damage is actually going to take a long time to recover. The economy, though, when you look at gross domestic product, the broadest measure of economic growth, is following a different path. Now, the first thing we have to acknowledge is historically GDP does come back before jobs. You saw that in the great financial crisis. GDP returned far, far, far quicker than the people that lost their jobs. And that's partly because of that K-shaped recovery, because you do have the healthy stock market and healthy home equity, and you have some people that have their incomes going up or they're saving more money, and then they're able to spend that money. That's what's able to drive the economy, regardless of what's happening on the labor front. Goldman Sachs, very, very optimistic. They're the yellow on this graph. They're basically saying things are going to be smooth sailing from here. Fiscal stimulus, great. Economy opens up, fantastic. Vaccine, just expect continued growth. We do follow a similar trend as Goldman Sachs at Zonda with our forecast. We're just not calling for as robust of growth. So you can see we're kind of in the middle of the pack. We believe that based on our forecast today, GDP will get back to 4Q 2019 levels by the third quarter of 2021. But there's been this interesting dynamic. Remember, I said the jobs market and GDP is not going to recover at the same pace. Same thing, the jobs market and the housing market has not recovered at the same pace. So let's take a step back. What I'm showing you here are the markets that are the most recovered by local area. So we know there's no such thing as a national housing market. There's also no such thing as a national economy, but there are trends that permeate, which is why we start with the national picture. Here, what you're seeing is Indianapolis is nearly 80% recovered of the jobs lost earlier this year. Again, for comparison, national average, 56%. Keep looking at the table. Austin, Salt Lake City, Virginia Beach, Louisville, Cincinnati, Austin, Atlanta, Phoenix, all of those growing about 70% plus of all of the jobs lost have now come back. You look on the other side. Look at the bottom of this table. These are showing you the markets that are the furthest from recovering. Orlando, 28% of the jobs lost have come back. You see San Francisco, DC, LA, Portland, each of these markets have their own unique story that's explaining why their labor market hasn't returned. But it almost doesn't matter if you're looking at the table on the left or the right. We are seeing housing strength even as the economic data continues to suffer. And I think part of that is because we've seen a fundamental shift in our economy. Our economy has historically been a service-based economy. Think about in 2019, all we did is talk about experiences. Change this to have an experience. Go to the mall, you want an experience. Buy a home, you want an experience. Well, the experience economy got hit because usually services is more high touch. You have to be around people. That's not good in a COVID environment. So goods and services both crashed in April. Look at that orange. You see goods came back and is thriving better than pre-pandemic. Services still struggling. But people have been wanting to spend their money. You see that in the retail sales data, although the retail sales data that came out earlier this week, not as positive, but generally we've seen strength on that front. Auto sales, really, really good. And of course, the housing market. And that's where I want to transition. Like I mentioned, in my role, I have to step back and look at what's happening in the broader economy. And honestly, I can't point to any sector that is stronger than housing. And what's been interesting about the housing market is that when we started to see growth, so let's take a step back, look at this chart, you can see housing tanked for a while because of COVID. In March and April, for about 4 to 8 weeks, depending on your market, things got ugly. And then things came roaring back. But it wasn't even at first. At first, in May and June, some markets, some price points, some demographics were fueling the strength. Where we are today, rapid, universal. It almost doesn't matter what price point, what location, what demographic you're targeting. We're seeing strength across the board. And what's been interesting for builders is they've been stuck at a fairly small market share of the total activity, of total transactions. So usually builders are, let's say, 10 to 11% of the overall market. A few months ago, builders got up to 15% market share, which was a really big shift. And you've seen that come down a little bit now at 13% of the overall market. And that comes down completely to supply, which I'll show you in just a moment. But I wanted to just hit this point a little bit more is as you look at the universal rebound, we go into our database. And as I mentioned, we track the new home market, 18,000 actively selling new home communities. And we want to understand what is selling. And as you would imagine, the entry-level product is selling the best. If you're a builder hitting an entry-level price point, the average is 3.6 sales per month per community, compared to the luxury market, which is 1.8 sales per month per community. But all of these numbers for entry level, for move up, for luxury have gone up this year. But interestingly, luxury relative to itself has gone up the highest. So you still see entry level doing better. But again, you've seen a pretty surprising spike in the luxury space. But again, that goes back to that K-shaped recovery. So as we step back and we look at the builder landscape, they would have gone into 2020, builders. They would have said, this is going to be a good year. And they would have said that because of the demographics and because of the low interest rates and a lot of the things that I talked about earlier. Builders did not plan for 40%, 30%, 50% year over year growth in sales. They couldn't have. They thought maybe 10%, and maybe that was even stretching a little bit. What we've seen is a direct result that inventory now is at the lowest level ever. And what makes this cycle different than last cycle is last cycle there was a lot of overbuilding going into the hype, and a lot of builders had standing inventory that when the music stopped, they had homes that they had to sell. This time around, we were honestly watching the quick move in inventory. We were saying, let's make sure this doesn't go up because that was the indicator last cycle. What we saw is any of the quick move in homes were absorbed instantly. From May, June, July, August, those were the homes that were flying off the shelf, to the point that now builders are doing dirt sales. They haven't even started building on some of those homes. The consumers are expecting a really long wait, in some cases a year and a half, from when they sign the contract to when they're moving into the new home. Now, the hope is that the resale market comes and steps in and fills that gap, but what we see on the resale inventory is that's also at the lowest level ever. Now, think back to Econ 101. We're talking about demand from every different demographic at all different price points and supply that's not keeping up. So, of course, we're seeing home price appreciation across the board. What I find interesting about this chart, so this is doing the same thing I showed you before. Bottom, let's say entry level, middle is move up, top is luxury. You're seeing that the bottom is definitely increasing almost 7% year over year, but the middle has become very, very competitive. Lack of inventory, you're seeing they're now moving in lockstep. Top, the luxury product rising as well. It goes back to, though, that this depends on where you live. If you're in Phoenix, if you're in Seattle, double-digit home price appreciation across every single category. That is unheard of. We have not seen numbers like that consistently. In the bottom tier, sure, you usually saw that the entry level was growing a lot, but to see that in the top tier is really remarkable. Go down the list. At the bottom, San Francisco, Houston. These are markets that if you read the headlines, they would tell you, the economy is tanking and it doesn't look good for housing demand. And yet we know that those markets are pretty strong as well. You can see between really 4 and 6% HPA depending on the price point in those markets. Now here's the thing. Eventually, these rapidly rising home prices will not be sustainable. They are outpacing incomes. They are reaching really scary numbers, way above the levels that we saw during the last cycle. The difference is mortgage rates. So we know mortgage rates were at 3.5%, and when they were at 3.5%, those were historically low interest rates. Now we're 2.7, depending on your credit score. That's seriously low. And what that does is it gives people more money every single month in terms of the monthly payment, but it also is really important in turning back time. I've had a lot of people say to me, I wish I would have bought a home 2 or 3 years ago. If you look at the monthly payment, housing is a monthly payment business. In a lot of cases, people can almost buy a home a few years ago. Top line, more expensive. Lock in the monthly payment. Think about the longer term of that. Some markets now have the closest year in terms of affordability 2, 3, 4, even 5 years ago. But watch that last column. That last column is telling you you can keep growing to a certain extent, but if HPA keeps going this high, this fast, even with low rates, let's assume rates don't go anywhere from where they are today, you can still really start bumping up against an affordability ceiling. But we have another interesting thing going for us today, and that's that people have been saving money. Think about the calculation for your mortgage. You're going to have your interest rates, you're going to have the home price, but you're also going to have your down payment. And what we've seen is a really elevated personal savings rate this year as people were almost forced to save. Because where were you going to go? You weren't going to spend your money anyways. 14% personal savings rate. That is above the 9%, which is our 61-year average, and above the 6 to 7% that we were at going into this cycle. Now, interestingly, we launched a millennial survey. We asked millennials, have you saved more money? 60% of them said yes, they have saved more money this year than last year. The number one thing they want to do is continue saving. The number two thing they want to do is use that money for a down payment. And that's really important in a market where first-time buyers are really driving a lot of the strength. So the last things I want to hit on here, I want to go through our forecasts and some final thoughts before I pass it on to Todd. And let's step back. We've shown you really this case for housing. We've talked that a lot of the issues we're facing are not demand side, because housing has a lot going for it. Whether people are relocating, whether people are realizing they just need more space, whether they're trying to take advantage of low interest rates or just pure demographics. There are a lot of factors that can support continued growth. And I think a fun thing here, what I'm showing in this picture, is some millennials said because they couldn't get married this year, they repurposed either some or all of their money of a big wedding to put that towards a down payment. So that's been an interesting factor that a lot of us didn't even consider in March and April, that could be fueling some of the additional support. So going into 2021, our forecast for single family housing starts is a 13% increase. And what I want you to recognize from this is part of this is just picking up homes that went under contract in 2020. Like I said, there were dirt sales, but the builders haven't been able to start them yet. We think some of that is going to get pulled into the first half of 2021, which will pull this number up, which is why we have a gap between our single family housing starts forecast and our home sales forecast. So we're calling for a 4% increase in new home sales. We do think it could be higher if affordability issues remain at bay and if the supply issues don't become an issue. But we've had a lot of builders say to us explicitly, we are only going to sell 4 homes this month. And once we're done selling those, we're not going to sell any more. That's not a demand issue, that's a supply issue. And we think that that's going to continue to be a downward pressure on the new home market. So as we look into 2021, some key things to watch. This came directly from the builders. We said, you're planning for 2021, you see all of the data on the ground, what are your issues? Number 5, building material costs. We're seeing with supply chain issues really across the board, builders are facing some pretty massive issues. Number 4, building material availability. Going back to the supply chain, these really go hand in hand, putting pressure on builders, because if we say builders plan for, let's say, 10% growth in 2020, a lot of suppliers would have too. So they're as overburdened as what we're seeing on the builder side. New home affordability. I'm glad builders are talking about it because I want it to remain top of mind for all of us. Land prices are obviously going up, and this idea that builders had planned for steady growth, not phenomenal growth, and some of them are afraid that in a short run, they may gap out of lots. They're quickly trying to hire more land acquisition analysts to backfill those positions. Now, with that, I am excited to bring in Todd Teta. He is the Chief Product and Technology Officer for ATTOM Data Solutions. And prior to joining the ATTOM team, Todd was the CTO for my company, Zonda, formerly known as Myers Research. And that's where I got to know Todd. We became friends. And Todd, I'm glad to be partnered back with you. I'm going to turn it over.
Great. Thanks, Allie. So first, I wanted to share a quick aside on how this webinar all came together. And when Jen asked me if I was up for doing an end-of-year look and 2021 outlook, a few thoughts went through my mind, of course. And the first one was, what do we have to add to an already packed calendar of forecasts, frankly? And then I realized, if there was ever a year to think about the future, this was it, right? And on a more personal level, I just figured it would be a good way to turn the page. The second thought, and probably most important, I want to thank Allie for joining us, is we have to get Allie to join us on this conversation. She's the economist I've looked to this year to help understand what the heck is going on in the economy and how it might impact real estate. She's able to decipher all the different data coming at us, because there's a lot, and make it simple to understand. So hopefully you all realize that after listening to her just now. And if you're not following her on social media, you need to be. And we'll include that on the links page a little bit later so you can. Allie did a great job framing the economy and the broader new home and resale markets, and I'll build on that a bit with some detailed thoughts on specific aspects of housing. I'll start with a deeper look at the current market conditions that Allie teed up. I think it'll help baseline everybody before we jump right into some of the more detailed factors, individual factors like prices, mortgages, etc. So this is a national view of the for sale market, builds on what Allie showed earlier, the supply dip that has happened, or L-shaped supply dip, if you will. And this is from our friends over at Altos Research. They track MLS listing activity across the US, and I like how they segment the market, price tier wise, very similar to what Allie was showing earlier, and it's real time. This is real time market condition data that I find useful. On the left, you'll see how the middle of the year, so right in the midst of the first wave of COVID, compares to how we're ending the year. And I think there are a couple of really key takeaways on this chart, or on these charts. First, take a look at the days on market metrics. We're down about 12% from that mid-year point, which just means homes are selling very quickly, even more quickly than they were in the middle of the year. And I think secondly, look at the trend on inventory back in June. Ali talked about historic lows on inventory. I want to show that back in June, we were already starting to see this inventory issue. These charts show, the ones on the left show a 3-year look back, or excuse me, a 3-month look back from April to June on inventory. And you can see that's already starting to trend down. Sellers weren't putting anything on the market or pulled their homes off the market thinking that they weren't going to be able to sell it in a COVID world, showings being difficult, etc. That you can see that's when inventory really started to drop. And I've tried to highlight that on the right, that it's only gotten tighter in that chart on the upper right. To put some specific numbers on what Ali mentioned about an inventory low, we're talking under 500,000 homes on the market today nationally as we exit the year. And you can see how dramatic a difference this is to prior years just by looking at the different color lines. Red is to this year. It's nearly a 50% drop in on-market homes compared to this time last year. So think about that. If half the supply of what we might have entered into 2020 with, we're going to be entering into 21 with, it's really barely any inventory compared to a balanced market. So that's the supply side of the equation. Let's kind of move on to the other side that will drive demand. And as Ali described, mortgage rates, I think, are the key factor there, at least initially. And I thought it would be helpful to paint a little bit deeper picture here. The chart here is the 3-year view. It shows how dramatically low rates have really gotten, starting in the middle of 2019 and continuing through this year, really on steroids through COVID. We're ending the year, like Ali mentioned, right around 2.7, well under 3% for the last 3 months, or last 5 months, excuse me. And that's crazy to think about when you talk about monthly payment, which Ali illustrated really nicely when you talk about an actual dollar impact to a borrower. Looking to next year, we're definitely expecting an uptick from where we're at now. The adverse market fees that I talked about in our mortgage webinar a few months ago are fully priced in. We think those are fully priced in. That's what we're hearing. And will likely settle into right around a 3% rate for most of next year, well, at least well into next year. That said, there are 2 things that we're keeping our eye on that we think could really, potentially, I should say, increase rates more than we're thinking. And I talked about these in the webinar a few months ago before the election, but they're worth repeating. The first factor is mortgage-backed security purchases by the Fed. And keep in mind, these provide liquidity into the mortgage market, keeps rates lower. Originators are able to offer lower rates because of it. And what the levels of purchase will be next year is somewhat unknown. And I don't think we'll fully know until we get a full plan from the new Biden administration. But given the Fed minutes this week, came out today actually, we're expecting continued purchases, the same levels of securities purchases well into next year, which we think will keep rates pretty steady through most of the year. And then likely increase as those purchases taper off later in the year, assuming the economy plays out the way it's projecting. So this would increase rates slightly. The second factor I think that's also interesting on mortgage rates is FHA for conservatorship for Fannie and Freddie. The ending of conservatorship, that's the government custodian for these corporations rather than them being private enterprises or full private enterprises, puts capital rules on the GSEs that they hadn't had before. They have to save and have on hand a certain amount of money to run their business. That's not been the case within the conservatorship framework. So this became a wild card this week too. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin essentially taking conservatorship or ending of conservatorship off the table before the Biden administration takes office. And we're just frankly expecting that conservatorship is going to continue well into next year, if not long term, but potentially with some different capital rules than what they have today. I bring that up only as something to keep an eye on. It's unclear what that's going to do to mortgage rates, but it will have an impact one way or another. And like I said, we're expecting rates to stay around 3% for most of the year, with a slight increase in the latter half as these factors play themselves out. Let's move on from rates to mortgage volumes. because I think that's a better reflection of actual mortgage demand than rates might be, rates being just the driver of it. Excuse me. This slide is trying to show what the difference between purchase and refi volumes are, right? So some portion of mortgage loans are for purchasing a house and some are for refinancing a house. And this is showing a 7-year look at that. Last month, we put out our Q3 loan origination report. So this is reflecting the latest numbers. And just to play back a little bit of what 2022 was, Q2, we saw that huge spike in refinances. Ali's slide called it the mortgage or magic of mortgage rates. And I think that's a great way to characterize it, because when rates came down to that 3% level, refinances really took off, as you can see in this slide. And they stayed there for all of the rest of the year. We don't have final Q4 numbers, but obviously we're expecting originations to be dominated by refinances in Q4 too. So for next year, we're expecting that to taper off a little bit. Refinances are working their way through the system. We do think that there's upwards of 20 million, probably somewhere in the range of 15 to 20 million borrowers that could use a refinance where the math would pencil for them. But we expect purchases will return for all the factors Ali described in the economy, some of the inventory factors we're going to talk about and or have talked about. And we expect the purchase market to return to right around $1.4 to $1.5 trillion. So, which you can see on the chart how that would line up historically. It's a healthier origination market than what we saw this year. Let's move on to sales and prices, because I think that's a next factor that's worth talking about. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about 2020 because frankly, it was just a weird year. 2020 started out pretty strong on pretty much every metric that we look at. So I'm talking about the Q1 numbers, pricing, equity, seller tenure, which for us, that means the time a seller has owned the home when they sell it, all reached peaks in Q1. While distressed sales were at their lowest point in 13 years. So all in all, super healthy. We thought 2020 was going to be a good year, for real estate. And then of course, COVID hit. We've talked about this story throughout today's webinar. And as we got into Q3, pricing jumped 17% year over year in a quarter for that quarter, which is pretty incredible. So I don't think we can really read into the 2020 data other than it was a weird year. On the whole, we're ending 2020 in a really good place on sales and pricing, and that sets up 2021 to be a great year for real estate. And what we do believe is going to happen is Q1 and Q2 are going to be continued short-term phenomenon on pricing as some of the new home inventory Ali described comes into the market, that hasn't already been sold or under contract. And as pricing continues to go up, sellers will get off the fence and start putting their homes on the market. So we do believe that supply and prices and corresponding sales will ease as we get further into the year. The last point I'll make is we're fully expecting the selling season next year to extend into Q3. Most of you know that it's extending into Q4 this year. And really just got deferred. If you just think of it moving back several quarters in 2020, we're expecting some of the same, at least into Q3 of next year because of the vaccine, when that will actually come, fully available to everybody, potentially into Q4. But that too should keep the market pretty strong into the latter part of next year. And to put some numbers on it, just overall nationally, we're expecting small increases in prices, low to mid single digits, sales volumes, hopefully as high as 10% higher than what we saw this year, for all the reasons we talked about, more resale inventory, new home construction. Ali mentioned 13%, share of market or starts. So hopefully some of that actually closes in 2021 and we see a return there. So I think the next thing everyone is wondering about is foreclosures. A lot of you know that we do a lot of tracking of foreclosure data, have done it for 20 plus years. And to remind everybody, before COVID hit, we had expected 2020 to be flat relative to 2019 when we had just under 500,000 filings nationally. And of course, we were just a bit outside on that. And what really happened is forbearance programs and the foreclosure moratoriums essentially paused foreclosure activity, at least in residential markets. And as you can see in this chart here for Q2 and Q3, we're expecting Q4 to be pretty much the same. We have seen a slight uptick in foreclosure filings in Q4, but nothing nearing what we saw last year or prior years. So think of it as just flatline through Q4, and overall a low for this most recent cycle over the last 10 to 12 years. FHFA still seems to have a strong willingness to extend the moratoriums, most recently extending them. So we're expecting that to just continue. We've got an administration that seems very willing to support home buyers and homeowners staying in place. So again, we're expecting those moratoriums to continue potentially towards the middle of the year. We're also expecting a lot of loan modifications to memorialize all the forbearances. And frankly, the program to have essentially worked for what it was intended to do, to give borrowers time to recover from any COVID impacts where they had them. That said, we continue to believe foreclosures are going to tick up. They are going to be driven by market conditions going into the year, but by mid-year. How the larger recession plays out, as Ali described, and of course, something Ali also talked a lot about, which was unemployment and some of the misnomers that are out there around the low unemployment rates. We believe, just as does Ali, that you got to look deeper into the numbers, and that's going to drive foreclosures just like it historically has. Our middle case scenario on foreclosures points to somewhere around a 2015, 2016 level of foreclosures. And I'll remind everybody that that's not a huge foreclosure year. So, don't think that there's some wave of foreclosures out there that are going to happen. But we do believe that the uptick will come. Question is when, and it's increasingly looking like nothing is going to happen until later in the year next year and potentially carry through 2022. Ali gave that range on unemployment and jobs recovery somewhere between 1.5 and 3.5 years, and that times similarly with what we're thinking on foreclosures. And it's also worth one last note on foreclosures I'll mention, and that's distressed sellers should have options, or distressed borrowers should have options. Given equity positions and this incredibly high price run up that we've had in the last 10 months, will help those borrowers that do get into stress. They should be able to sell, and so that also will mute some of the foreclosure impacts that we would have otherwise seen from a recession like we're having. So, and then I thought it would be good to cover flipping as a last topic. We just released our latest report on this morning, or yesterday, excuse me, and this is really a small part of the market. So it's an outcome, which I believe is an outcome of just the broader market. And what I mean is flippers really participate in the broader market, meaning they get the benefits and the challenges of it. And let me just frame it with a couple of definitions so everybody knows what we mean when we talk about a flip. For us, that's a home that retransacts within its first year of ownership. We also look at buy and sale prices to calculate an ROI. You can see both of those on this chart here. It doesn't consider upgrades at a detailed level. So if somebody's going in and really upgrading a home, we're not going to isolate that from just general price appreciation that might be happening. But it is, it's an imperfect methodology, of course, but we've been using it for a long time. It's trendable. And that's what's really important to us, is the trend in the numbers. And what we saw in 2020 for flippers is they had really limited buying opportunities, and that drove a 4-year low in the rate of flipping when you think of it as a percent of the overall market, overall sales. Really strong pricing trends have made it quite profitable for you to be a flipper if you happen to have some inventory, or you could find some. In a COVID world, you made a lot of money. You can still see that, and you can in fact see a tick up that we measured towards the end of the year, just like everybody else selling. So we expect opportunities for flippers to improve slowly through 2021. but very slow, frankly, coming into the market. Some of those foreclosures we talked about, sellers in general becoming more likely to sell, those will create opportunities, but we're expecting a fairly challenging from an opportunity standpoint for flippers even next year. Before I turn it back to Jen, I wanted to take a moment to say thanks to everybody that's joined us for our webinars this year. You could have all just tuned out, stuck your head in the sand and tried to survive 2020, but you didn't. You came in and listened to our webinars. We appreciate that, and hope to see you next year as we continue this kind of series. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jen to close us out.
Thank you so much, Todd and Allie. Great presentation. We did have, as you know, you can submit some questions, and so we do have some questions that came through. I'll have a moment to answer a few, and then the rest we will definitely get to within 2 business days. But the first question I think would be best for Allie, and that question is, so when will boomers have to downsize?
Interesting. Okay, so for the boomers, the first thing we have to acknowledge is that this is a 20-year time frame of individuals that have different wealth and different lifestyles spread across the country. And not all boomers will choose to downsize. In fact, because of the COVID crisis, we've seen more boomers actually upgrade their living situation because they're spending more time at home, and maybe because of the low interest rates and the combination of the better stock market, they're in a position that they can. So I think you can expect to see a fair share will downsize like they always have. You can expect to see that many will improve their situation like we're seeing now, in particular in the new home market. You'll see some boomers will relocate, and then they'll probably fall in one of those 2 buckets, but we've seen that baby chasers. So we know a lot of people have moved this year, in particular millennials. When millennials move, they often have their parents follow them because they want to be close to the grandbabies. So when you see that happen, you could see a change in their overall lifestyle, though again, they could fall in one of those 2 categories or stay the same. And then the final thing I'll say is often the boomers are holding on to the entry-level homes, but in some cases they have enough net worth that they can hold on to their entry-level home, use it as a rental, as an investment property, and then go ahead and change their own living situation too. So I don't know if the question was looking for when are we going to see more of that supply hit the market, because they are keeping the entry-level supply tight. I think it'll still be a long time to see that change.
Great, thank you. Okay, now Todd, what about, now we have this other question. How is quantitative easing going to affect the housing market? And then how will the new administration differ in housing policy?
Sure. Yeah, and I touched on quantitative easing, or QE, earlier with the Fed MBS purchasing. For those of you that didn't see today's or yesterday's announcement and meeting minutes, the Fed's made some short-term commitments at least to continuing the purchases. So at the same levels, I think it's 80 billion and 40 billion on bond and mortgage-backed securities a month. So pretty significant numbers that they'll continue to inject money. And Jerome Powell came out and said that they'll do what they need to support the broader economy. And they have a lot of tools left to do that. There's not a lot of detail behind what those tools are, except for purchases and short-term interest rates. But we'll see. I think QE is a tool that has been used, for the last recent time, and if with it continuing, it'll help mortgage rates stay where they're at and stay low. I also think it brings a confidence factor into the market. Just simply saying we're going to support the market, no matter what, is meaningful and should drive continued recovery, at least from a policy standpoint. So that's the QE question. On the housing policy question, just we have a new administration coming into office in a month, and from a stated policy standpoint and the platform that was put forth during the election, there's a couple of key things that I think are worth noting. One is on the COVID front. I mentioned the moratoriums I think what you're going to see is the administration support moratoriums much longer than would have happened under a prior administration, prior Trump administration, and really just support that side of the equation and borrowers staying in their homes. So that's one thing I'd note from a policy standpoint, that would be a little bit different than I would have expected if the policy change hadn't, or if the administration hadn't changed. The other one is around affordable housing, fair housing and affordable housing, much more proactive stance on affordable, certainly affordable housing metrics and goals, and then fair housing regulation. I think those two things are clearly going to be more supported within a Biden administration than what you might have seen in some of the rollbacks that happened under the Trump administration. And then the last point I'll make, which I think is actually only going to drive demand and help what Allie started talking about when she talked about saving rates and down payments, which is first-time home buyer down payment credits as a tax credit. That hasn't been put in place obviously yet, but when and if it does, I think you're going to see more first-time home buyers try to get into the market. Hopefully pricing hasn't fully priced them all out yet, but being a retro tax credit is helpful with driving demand. I would expect that we'll see home ownership rates continue to grow. They actually grew quite healthily during the Trump administration. I think we're just going to continue to see that. So yeah, I think that's it. I think that covers it.
And Todd, there's an interesting anecdote I just heard on the first-time buyer, the first-time tax credit. I had one of our regional directors, we have people across the country, and one of the guys told me that he was talking to a builder who said for the first time, they're now starting to hear from potential home buyers, I really like this community and I want to buy here, but I hear there's going to be this first-time tax credit, and so I'm going to wait and see, and I'm going to step out of the market for the next few months. And maybe that's a one-off or a few off, but I think we should watch to see if there is any pullback in demand. It could just be in response to, well, hey, I could have $15,000 to help me buy this purchase if I just wait a couple months.
Right. Yeah, it's an unintended consequence, right? Just deferring buying. So.
Great. Well, I think we have time for one more. And Allie, I think this is defer to you. What is the sustainability of the housing market for the future?
How do I answer without saying everyone wants to know? Right? We all want to know what's going to happen because there are so many moving parts. And I don't mean to discount the question because I think it's the right question to ask. And then you have to start peeling the onion to figure out what are the different things that could slow the sustainability of the market. I think for what it's worth, most forecasters and economists, you heard it from Todd, you heard it from myself, a lot of other big firms are calling for 2021 to continue to be a good year for housing. It doesn't seem like, based on what we know today, it doesn't seem like there's any reason why it shouldn't. There is some concern about wallet share. So like we talked about the goods versus service economy, there could hit a point where people have been able to buy homes so easily right now because their student loans are deferred, because they're not going on vacation, because they're not spending money on the service base, they're not buying avocado toast and $15 margaritas, which could change as the economy reopens. So we should watch for wallet share, just check out if it does impact demand or not. And there's a lot of question about how much of the demand do we pull forward. And a lot of people are nervous that, we're talking about 40, 50% growth year over year. Does that just mean in future years, we're not going to see the same strength? And what I would argue on that front is, sure, there are some people that would have bought 3 years from now that decided to buy now. But if you look at the homeownership rate in particular for millennials, to Todd's point, yes, it's been going up. But if you look at millennials in 2019 compared to the year 2000, the same age group owns homes at a lesser level, even after the strength we've seen this year. So I still think there's an opportunity on the millennial front and on the Gen X front when we think about how much of this has been pulled forward.
Great. Thank you again, both so much. Very informative. Again, for those questions we couldn't get to, we will answer those within 2 business days. And then also I just want to thank you everyone for attending. A few quick resources before you leave us today. Please visit our website at attomdata.com for more information on ATTOM and how you can utilize our data to power your business. Again, thank you so much, and we hope you enjoyed our presentation. And just a reminder, a copy of this webinar will be sent to you. Thanks so much, all.